who were Elizabeth Meyer, who really helped me set these simulations up in AppSim and taught me about nitrogen cycling and setting up greenhouse gas emissions in AppSim. Also James Hunt from University of Melbourne, who really helped get the structure right for the publication, and Therese and Rick, who supported the piece of work along the whole process. So to set the scene, globally there's a need to increase crop production and maintain soil fertility while reducing our environmental impact. So in Australia, intensive wheat production is increasingly dependent on synthetic nitrogen, which represent about 38% of our total on-farm greenhouse gas emissions. So on the one hand, we've got increasing emissions due to an increased demand on synthetic nitrogen, but the yield gap in Australian farming systems can be, for wheat yields, can be explained by nitrogen deficiency by 40%. So a N deficiency affects more than just crop yield. A deficient crop will mine nitrogen that mineralizes out of soil organic matter. So when a N balance is negative, soil organic matter declines, which releases carbon dioxide, declines soil fertility and structure. So where is the best source of nitrogen to profitably sustain crop production while also minimising our environmental impact? Australia has 4 major sources available to wheat production, and they are N mineralised from native soil organic matter, or the second source is from N derived from N fixation from legume crops and pastures grown in rotation with wheat. Third option is synthetic N fertiliser produced through the harbour process and largely in urea. And the fourth source is with N-rich manures, composts, biosolids and other organic wastes. So each of the different sources have different economic and environmental impacts, and a farmer can change what source they're using depending on their management. But in Australia, where our wheat is grown across large areas and at lower yields, with limited access to cost-effective sources of organic wastes, it essentially restricts Australian farms to the top 3 sources. So the N-bank strategy, which I believe the RiskWi group is probably fairly familiar with, but I will give a brief overview, is that it's a strategy that is a way to determine the amount of nitrogen to supply to crops. And the premise is that it maintains a positive N balance and reduces mining of organic N, and therefore maximises production by limiting N deficiencies. So it requires setting a target N bank, which is determined between the average rainfall and optimal N bank based on a long-term yield, and it requires a longer-term fertiliser approach. If the environmental losses are low, which emerging research is that it is, the approach may be able to contribute to those nitrogen yield gaps in Australian wheat yields. So the neat thing about the N-bank strategy is that it could be used to as a baseline to compare different legume crop rotations to be able to quantify the changes in artificial N applied. So I'm from a farming background, and my sisters are currently home on the farm, and I'm often discussing with them different projects and experiments I am involved in. And at the time, at the start of this study, I was telling them about a different legume rotation experiment we had locally. And it led to this question of, well, I wonder what our current farming systems are actually contributing to the total N supply longer term. And I thought that's actually a great modelling question, because these rotation experiments tend to be shorter term, sort of 3 to 5 years, whereas using the modelling approach means we can look over a longer period of time and look at more seasons and climate variability. So this leads to the question on the N banks on if the N inputs into an N bank need to be fertiliser. So particularly in low fertility and low to medium rainfall environments, it's assumed that N banking via fertiliser alone won't be a viable option. In addition to most Australian farming systems already incorporate a legume, and they historically have contributed to N supply and maintaining soil organic matter. So what can legumes contribute to N supply? And by quantifying their contribution, can we reduce our artificial N applied to maintain an N bank? So a bit now on the method of setting up the simulations. So we used Apsium to look at the long term, so the years 1991 to 2020, to look at the N contribution of legumes. So grain legumes and brown manure legumes, which in the talk I refer to as cover crops, because we were targeting an international audience with the paper, but it's the same thing as a brown manure. So that's when the legume crop is terminated at potting, and the grain legume is taken through to harvest. And we also compared this against long fallow, so when there is no crop the previous year to the subsequent wheat crop. And we grew these at increasing frequency in the crop rotation to look at the contribution to the N bank. So to show that a bit clearer what I mean by increasing frequency, I'm talking about, so a 0% rotation intensity refers to continuous cereal, so no rotation. 25% means one rotation every 4 years. 33% means one in every 3 years. 50% means one every second year. And 67% means two of the rotations for every cereal. So, and in rotation, there's either grain legume, brown manure, or long fallow. So wheat crops received a top-up of nitrogen at sowing if soil mineral N in the surface 1 metre was less than 40 kilos. And crops received an in-season top-up 65 days after sowing. And that depended on the N bank target minus the soil mineral N in the top 1 metre. We evaluated 4 sites from low to high rainfall zones, and the first strategy to reach 80% of yield potential or economic yield was determined the optimal N bank. So here's my rough map showing on a map where the sites are, just so you can visualise it a bit better. So Waikerie and Lameroo are in the low rainfall zone, and as you head south, Bordertown and Millicent are receive more rain. So just briefly, I thought I'd share a bit on the method on how we selected our optimal N bank for each environment before getting into the metrics. So this figure is showing the fraction of water limited yield potential on the y-axis, and across the x-axis is the N bank target. And looking up and down is the grain legume increasing intensity as you move down the figure, and the same for cover crop and winter fallow, with continuous cereal being that top left-hand panel. And the number above each of those box plots is the mean nitrogen applied to maintain that N bank. So we fitted an exponential curve to the relationship between the fraction of water limited yield potential and the N bank. And then we solved that equation to determine what the optimal N bank was at economic yield. So once we had the true, I refer to them as the true optimal N bank for each of the sequence by intensity combinations, we rerun the simulations, and these are the outputs that I will show in the rest of the slides. So we were able to, with the outputs from these true simulations, plot the N applied to achieve economic yield against intensity of the rotation. So for grain legume, this figure is showing for every grain legume % increase in area, the mean N application rate required to maintain economic yield can be reduced by 1.3 units of N per hectare. So similar figure, the same figure was done for cover crops and for the winter fallow. So the mean reduction in nitrogen application was the same for, or very similar for cover crops as it was for grain legume. And for winter fallow, it was, the reduction was slightly less. So the simulation, these figures are showing that the legumes at 25 to 67% intensity can reduce the N application required to maintain economic yield, but only in low rainfall environments and with cover crops greater than 50%, so over here, could the need for nitrogen be totally removed. So from these true sequences, we then investigated the different trade-offs against production, profitability, and environmental outcomes. So I'm about to share a range of intense-looking figures, but they are all sort of set up in the same way with a different metric on the y-axis, but the same x-axis, which is the rotation intensity and the different locations. But I'm going to highlight the key trends, so I don't want you to get too bogged down in trying to understand the figure. So from a food security perspective, calorific energy production was reduced in all sequences and intensities compared to continuous wheat. And that was true for all sites except for a grain legume grown at 25 to 33%. So this reduction in calorific energy was greater in cover crops. So you can see how the box plots are decreasing as intensity increases for cover crops and for winter fallow. So then moving on to an economic figure, the red line is showing 0. And these figures are showing that applying the N to the target optimal N bank, which is the continuous serial rotation, was profitable at all sites. And the most profitable sequences included grain legumes. However, cover crops and fallow sequences also managed to maintain a positive gross margin at all intensities and sequences at all sites, though it declined. So to put this into something practical and linking it back to that core question that started the study, to what extent does legume frequency reduce long-term N fertiliser requirements? Or how do I reduce my N inputs by 20 kilos per hectare or my cost by $65 per hectare? It's to grow a grain legume in 1 in 3 years at Waikerie or 1 in 4 at the other sites with the same pattern came out for a cover crop. So Brendan asked to make sure I had some discussion on risk, and this is how we talked about risk in the publication. We plotted mean gross margins against the 20th percentile gross margin, and so treatments that have a high profit and low risk are those that are in the top right-hand panel, right-hand corner of each panel. And I've put a red box around those. So all the scenarios that are in those boxes tended to be dominated by grain legumes in all environments, with strategies with the greatest risk being cover crops and winter fallows implemented at high intensity, which are in the opposite corner of those panels. So what this tells us is that the end fertiliser savings from having a fallow or a cover crop legume don't outweigh the lost income when considered over the whole sequence. So the other thing on this figure was that while the grain legumes were more profitable than continuous wheat at all sites, so continuous wheat is a yellow dots, there was they were actually more risky in the lower rainfall environments for Waikerie and Lameroo. And this is due to a more riskier environment, and so therefore greater production risk of legumes in the lower rainfall environments. So to look at the environmental implications of the different strategies, this figure is showing the different inputs and outputs of nitrogen across the different scenarios and different intensities. So the main trends from this figure are that as legume intensity increases, the proportion of N derived from fertiliser decreases. So the mean N losses by denitrification and leaching were predicted to be quite low at 6 to 23%, with the highest losses being at the high rainfall site, Millicent, and with increasing legume and fallow intensities. So the other environmental trade-off we looked at was calculating global warming potential from the different scenarios. So the calculations don't include emissions from fertiliser production and are only soil-based nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And when a number is negative, so when the median box plot drops below that red line for any given scenario, it means that there's abatement. So that means where there's been building of soil organic carbon, which has exceeded the emissions from the nitrous oxide. So at Lameroo and Waikerie, increasing the intensity of legumes reduced the global warming potential. But at Bordertown and Millicent, when legume frequency increased, global warming potential increased as well. And this is associated with the higher rainfall and residue turnover. So that's what we're looking at is the higher turnover, higher emissions for the two bottom sites, which are Bordertown and Millicent there. So we made a heap of radar plots for each of the scenarios where we were comparing a given strategy to the continuous wheat scenario. And this is useful for trying to look at where things worked out better for the different metrics or where they turned out worse. And if you're interested in looking a bit closer, I suggest just going to the publication, but I just wanted to show an example of the sort of figure we made for this. But there were some general trends across all environments, and these were that grain legumes at an intensity of up to about 50% had the optimal outcome under each measure for each environment. So while there were some negative outcomes, such as greater N mining or greater emissions as intensity of grain legume increased, there were also some positives, such as a reduction in the N application, abatement, and soil and building. Similar positive and negative trade-offs could also be drawn from cover crop and fallow scenarios, but none of these scenarios were also able to maintain both production and profitability, and therefore were unrealistic scenarios to achieve global food security in the long term. So that brings me to my conclusion slide. I know that was a lot of information, but the key points from the study are that simulations predict high intensity legume phases can reduce or completely remove mean N fertiliser application required to maintain an optimal N bank. But only cover crops at equal to or greater than 50% intensity could completely replace the requirement of N fertiliser while also maintaining economic yield. Inclusion of grain legumes in the sequence with wheat reduced global warming potential in low rainfall environments, but this was increased in environments with high soil organic matter. The strategies evaluated here should be validated in a long-term field experiment, but a study like this can help to guide those treatments for different environments. So I have another conclusion slide with some caveats because I have a healthy dose of skepticism too, so I made this slide. But there's practical things to think about when applying the output, the key messages from this paper, and that while our simulations indicate that sequences with grain legumes growing at 20 to 50% were marginally more profitable compared to continuous wheat, grain legumes are less reliable in terms of production and price in comparison to cereals and canola. And with grain legumes, markets, prices, and higher intensity of management and higher skilled required to grow legumes may provide barriers to a wider adoption, because in practice, growing grain legumes at high intensity would require careful management. So that's it from me, Brendan.
Thanks, Bonnie. That was excellent and kept even better to time than predicted. You're worried you were going to talk a bit long, but that was perfect.
Great.
I think the big story there for me coming through was around trade-offs, and it's something that RiskWi as a project sort of grapples with communication of those trade-offs. So grain legumes might be good for reducing N vulnerability, increasing profitability, but trading off with frost, on-farm storage, volatile markets, etc., etc. So some things for us to consider there as well. Do people want to raise hands if they had questions? Anybody with questions? If not, that was a.
I've got one, Brendan, but I was letting other people kick in first. Bonnie, one of the challenges with getting legumes in a modelling context and the dynamics that go about with them is getting the, I guess, the nitrogen balance of those systems right. Yep. Do you want to comment about some of the uncertainties that might go along with some of the assumptions in the model and how that might have altered the outcome of your simulations or not?
Yep. I shouldn't have stopped sharing my slides. But yes, that's definitely a question that came up with the reviewers on this work. So a question was, the whole system is relying on the legumes accurately supplying nitrogen to the crops. So how do we know that APSIM is doing that correctly? And so we did look at this. The numbers were within the range of published studies, which was, let's get rid of that. Good. So then we did come up with this validation using published field data. So the Unkovich 2010 paper had a range of N fixation versus shoot biomass data, and we plotted that, and then we plotted our APSIM outputs against that and found that APSIM overestimates N fixation by about 10 kilos of N per tonne of biomass for the cover crop. And it was slightly better for the grain legume of 4 kilos of N per tonne of biomass for the grain legume. But yes, as all modelling studies, I think the point isn't to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty, but to look at the trends and think about how we can use those trends to apply them to decisions we make for the future.
Yeah, Holbrook, Lancaster, sorry, missed the name, please.
Sorry, it doesn't change for me. It's Alison. How you going, everybody? Look, I'm not a a legume expert, as I'm sure there's others in the room better to able to handle this. But my understanding is that legumes generally are a bit lazy, and that the higher the nitrogen, the less they'll actually fix. You've got linear curves there. And I guess it's just a follow on from what Lindsay was saying. This is highly reliant on the APSIM modelling it well. Does it actually take into account, as nitrogen levels in the soil increase, that legume behaviour will change?
Yes, it did actually, because we went and checked this. So in the higher rainfall environments with the higher soil organic matter, they often stopped fixing at the very high intensities of rotation. So in the rotation. So the answer is yes, APSIM did take that into account. How perfectly aligned that is with the field data, though, I'm not sure, but I thought it was neat that it did take that into account.
Over to the NPL room.
Hi, Bonnie. Peter Hangman. Fantastic presentation, and huge amount of data, and you explain it really well, and really nice links to practical. For RiskWi, I guess I'm interested in this question, just in terms of presentation. Obviously, you've got lots of skills in producing lots of box plots and so on. Why did you choose to represent risk as the 20th percentile versus the mean?
Yes.
Whereas other things, you just put lots of box plots. I'd suggest that if you just present, why don't you just do the economics for risk as a box plot? I think I would find that easier to understand.
Which we do. I did. Is that what you mean? The gross margins with?
Yeah. So that's.
So that's a box plot, but I guess you're.
Okay, so that's there, and then you did.
Yeah.
So it's the same data as that. That's presented at the 20th percentile versus the.
Yeah, but it's just the means, isn't it? It's not showing the variation around that mean. So I could put some error bars or something on there. Like, would that solve that query?
No, I think. Sorry.
No,
A much wiser colleague Cam is going to comment.
I was supporting what you're going to say. No.
Dueling questions.
Yeah, okay. No, I need to look at that and the other one and see whether the other one adds anything to what I see there. I mean, this question of how do we communicate risk.
Yeah, I think the other one just makes it clearer where the least risky scenarios are for different environments. It just makes it visually stand out clearer to me. But yeah, it's not showing the variation. You're right. But it is looking at the 20th. Yeah, it's looking at the lowest 20%. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. Cam Nicholson, Bonnie, thanks for the presentation. The GWP stuff you did you do anything on emissions intensity? That seems to be the flavour in the supply chain at the moment with Scope 3 emissions, is understanding emissions intensity. You presented a lot of what I could just see were emissions per hectare, but not against product produced. Because the supply chain's looking for
the emissions per
how many kilos of CO2 per kilos of grain.
Of grain.
For example.
No.
That's that's where the industry the supply chain chasing at the moment.
Yeah, Lindsay's got something to add.
Well, I was just going to say you can't do it, Cam, when you're comparing legumes and cereals in a context that Bonnie's doing, because the yields aren't comparable. So you've got to do it either on an energy or a dollars process or protein basis. So it makes it really hard to do effectively for this sort of analysis, I think.
Yeah, because there's lots of questions around about, do we put more legumes in to reduce the amount of nitrogen to therefore improve emissions intensity?
I wonder if it would say a similar trend to what we've found, though. Yeah, I think it would still say the same thing. So in low rainfall environments, increasing legume intensity reduce the potential global warming potential, but in wetter environments with higher turnover of residues and everything, the global warming potential was higher with more legumes. So I think that similar would come out.
Yeah. So you chose calories as your way to standardise the different crops. Yeah. So perhaps that's how you could measure intensity most easily. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and we also did protein, but I didn't include that in this talk, but it's in the paper.
I'll stop introducing everyone as we go. If you see that you're next in the hands line, please just go ahead. So Marta, next.
Marta.
Yeah, I think my camera has not been working. Apologies for that. In relation to the economic analysis, while gross margins provide a good reference, I suppose a more accurate way of going about that, given that you've got a 30-year rotation, would be a discounted cash flow analysis.
Cash flow analysis. Yeah,
where you would have would calculate the net present value of the benefits and the costs over the time of the rotation and the nitrogen fertilizer investment, and then you could apply the risk analysis through by drawing from price and yield distributions. So that's been done before, and that's probably a more accurate way of going about it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And you could apply metrics such as conditional value at risk to calculate the downside risk in a more accurate way. So yeah. But otherwise,
there's so much I can learn about economic.
Yeah, but it is a very
data.
nice paper. I really like the way you've integrated all these things. It's great. So well done and very well presented, Bonnie. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. I think Rob.
Yeah, look, I'm probably covering some of the same stuff, but very good presentation and great work. So congratulations on that. I guess one of my little hobby horses is operating at the gross margin. It doesn't really reflect risk for two reasons, and certainly the previous person has highlighted the cash flow thing. But I think the other thing for me is just, where things are just above the gross margin line, we would know that once you added fixed costs into that, it'd be a significant loss. And therefore, I think even if, you're saying it's going to be difficult to get a fixed cost, I think you can get it from, there's lots of data out there to say certain farms have certain amounts of fixed costs. It just would give it that, when it's sitting below the line and you're making a loss, it changes the perception quite a lot to a gross margin which is sitting above the line. So that's probably one comment. And then the only other thing I was wondering, with your simulation, was there any benefit in uptake efficiency put against the nitrogen that was fixed by legumes compared to applications from mineral fertilisers?
And uptake efficiency from the legumes.
Yeah,
got that right?
Just in terms of less leaching probably, and nice continual supply, all that sort of stuff. Whether you'd expect to get perhaps some higher, in some situations, particularly in the drier environment.
Yep. I'll just see if this figure might capture it.
Bonnie, you can provide a little answer to if you want, which is
yes.
it's not that much more efficient because legume nitrogen's sitting around over summer. Whereas fertiliser nitrogen isn't in the simulation. So you have there was differences in efficiencies purely simulated by AppSim's availability. Yeah, when nitrogen became available and when crops used it, but legume nitrogen's actually massively exposed to loss because it's got to go through an entire summer fallow before it becomes available to a grain crop. Whereas
and we sort of saw that with our cover crop versus grain legume comparison, didn't we? In that you might think that more nitrogen is exported with a grain legume, meaning there's less nitrogen available for the subsequent crop, but the end decline is actually pretty similar for grain legumes and cover crops, because I think there is asynchrony of when the biomass becomes available to when the crop needs it. That makes sense.
I guess, although in some situations where you have big variations in yield, you might end up with nitrogen from mineral fertilizers sitting in soils, because the crop only went half what you expected or less. So would you think that would still be true, that you'd get bigger losses from the legume?
I think it probably depends a bit on the environment. I think the losses would be higher in the higher rainfall environments. Don't know if you have anything else to add there, James.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an artifact of the study that rainfall was also correlated with soil organic matter, soil organic carbon. So and the high rainfall sites had really high soil organic carbon in the soil files, and the legumes fixed very little nitrogen in those environments because there were such huge amounts mineralizing, which goes back to the question from Alison. And the losses of nitrogen in the legume systems are probably, well, they're higher than they would have been if we had have used a soil with a much lower organic carbon, because nitrogen was mineralizing out, nitrate was mineralizing out when the cover crop or legume was growing. The crop wasn't necessarily taking it up. And
actually, it kind of shows it in this figure of the high how the soil N declined over the duration of the simulation. So this is just showing total soil N over the whole duration of the simulation, and there was greater losses and higher rates of N mineralization from the high levels of soil organic matter in high rainfall environments, particularly at high intensities of legumes and fallow. So that figure sort of captures the high losses in high soil organic carbon soils.
Thank you.
Hi, Bonnie. I have a question about opportunity costs. So in the winter fallow system, the gross margin is sort of lower than the others. But I guess in a winter fallow, the farmer would free up some resources like their time and machinery and possibly some cash that then they could divert into other things. So I know your study is like a cropping rotation level, but what would farmers do with that? Do they have spare time if they don't fallow, and how could you value that in a sense?
Yeah, it's we don't value it as but it's like a logistic benefit, really, isn't it? I don't know how you would include time. Maybe you could put a money on per hour saved or something like that, but economists might have more ideas on that.
They would. I mean, it'd be going from the system to the whole farm. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a paper by David Cann as the lead author that we cite, because this relates to the question about discounted cash flow as well. And it's we thought about it, but because we were sort of covering all of the environmental, the food security, and the the economic, it was going to be an epic job to sort of do a whole farm discounted cash flow and try and account for the changes in logistics or the logistic benefits of either Longfellow or the logistic trade-offs and antagonisms of having legumes. And we decided it was a level of detail that was kind of too much for this particular study, but could certainly be pursued afterwards. But I'm pretty sure there's a sentence or a paragraph in the paper somewhere that says we recognise this, and we could have done it like Can et al., but we didn't because it was too hard.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I see that. Yeah, with Bill Malcolm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I was going to ask a similar question actually about the whole farm integration and specifically the potential benefits of weed management, having legumes in a rotation, if you could capture those extra benefits. But yeah, it's been addressed to some extent, so thanks.
In the absence of other hands, I'll ask one, which is obviously from a less technical perspective. Not to make anything uncomfortable at home, Bonnie, but if some hypothetical farm in Lamoureux was to ask what they should do in terms of the grain legumes or others, and particularly with a risk lens, what would your response be?
Well, I think what we are doing on our farm is we probably are growing a legume every 3 years, which I think did line up with one of my slides. But it depends on the availability of what sort of legumes you can grow in your area as well. So we've recently adopted legumes in sort of the last 5 years. So that means that we've got a profitable legume available, but I know as you head further north, a high value legume might not be available. It'd probably be vetch or lupin or something like that. So you're probably less comfortable adopting a higher intensity of legumes in the system.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Kenton.
It's more probably for the RiskWi or the NBank trials. How are you using this information to adjust your NBank targets now? Is there a fudge factor going into NBank on the back of some of this legume work?
Yeah, so Lindsay's and Ishmael's done the simulations with different rotations with different legume intensity to estimate NBank targets at different locations around Australia. So yeah, the practical upshot for using nitrogen banks as a decision-making system is that the higher your legume intensity, the lower your target needs to be, because you're getting more nitrogen provided from mineralisation of residues, and you also have to apply less N.
Last call. Yes, Dr. Kidd.
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks, Bonnie, for the talk. I guess my question is around even if you knew that you could attribute some N from your legume to the following crops. For us, I think it's how confident is that grower then able to reduce N inputs in the following season? Because I know plenty of growers that are not that confident and might still go with their normal nitrogen application program with synthetic fertilizers, and there's others who will reduce it by say 20% as a general rule. So there's kind of a few rules of thumb. So maybe this is a call to the other states as well. Is it confidence in how well that legume has gone as to how confident you are to then reduce your inputs?
Yeah, that's a really nice practical question. And I would say that I think this is why I probably think we need some long-term experiments that could actually add some field data on the quantification of this. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I asked that question in the context that we've got a grain legume adoption program in WA with GRDC funding, so we're trying to get more legumes into WA other than lupins, but it's hard to compete with canola. But you know, we have to sell it with more than just the kind of nitrogen benefits. You know, it has to be the kind of package deal of nitrogen, you know, assigning a value to a disease break or you know, different chemistries for your weeds, those kind of things, and then additionally any yield benefits, which you know have been shown to be 1 or 2 years, even 3 in some occasions if you grow a really good crop. So it's only that package deal that kind of gets it over the line, because it is a challenge. So
yes,
Daniel,
and there's also you go, James.
No, you go, Bonnie.
I was just going to say that there's also sort of the water balance story of it all too, with cover crops potentially carrying over more water to the subsequent crops. So in more drought environments, that could also be a positive edge to the legume story.
Daniel, I was just going to say that Coast to Sirlings and I think the Levy Group experiments in RiskWi are sort of answering, well, we'll answer that question for you, because they're rotation by nitrogen. And of course, the way they're working out how much you can cut nitrogen inputs by is by doing a soil test and seeing how much is actually there, because that's like in Mediterranean environments, most mineralization from legume residues happens over summer, late spring, summer, early autumn. Very little happens during the growing season. So if you're going to get it to the next crop, you'll be measuring it in your soil test.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I'll add, in the northern region where we've done 10 years of these experiments, that's essentially what happens. So essentially you end up having the same nitrogen allowance in the crops, but you might have less in some years following a legume, and sometimes you apply the same amount. It just depends on how that's become available and what the balance of that prior legume crop was. So in a different environment, of course.
In the absence of other hands, last call. Otherwise, all done and all sold. So thank you very much, Bonnie. I think some things for us to really think about in RiskWi, also around that communication of risk and how we package that into a lot of the end banking work that's there as well. We had about 35 people at the peak of the course. So that's a pretty good turnout as well for our reading club. So suggesting that the topic's a hot topic. And thank you very much for presenting.
Thanks for the opportunity.
With follow-ups.
Yep.
I'm sure that Bonnie can be found online, email. And thank you, everybody. And we are always looking for future suggestions as well. So if you see something, read something that you think is of use, please let us know, and we'll look to set something up. Thank you, everybody. Have great afternoons.